Good afternoon, and in this talk I'm going to speak about the enslavement of whites by Muslims. Not a topic that you're likely to find tackled in some of the mainstream newspapers, except I think rather those on the right. Now, slavery has become a very hot topic in the West because for many activists, this is seen as the reason why black people have failed to make the same advances in society as other groups. It's put down to the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, and which has not only impoverished blacks and prevented them from acquiring some of the skills and some of the skills required and used in contemporary society, but also created the institutional racism which is supposed to have held them back. There are problems with this view, but that's a slightly different issue. My point is that I'm concerned that the focus on black transatlantic slavery is given the wrongful impression that slavery was something that only white people did to blacks. In actual fact, slavery existed all over the world, and it existed in Africa before whites appeared. And horrifically, it still exists in Africa. There are several very good books about African slavery, such as Stillwell's Slavery and Enslaving in African History, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Here it is, right? Academic study published by a respected publisher. When it comes to the existence of slavery around the world, and remember, it wasn't just in Africa, it also existed in India, ancient China, North and South America with the states there, and also in the ancient world, in ancient Europe. One very good book is Jeremy Black's Slavery, A New Global History. It's quite a short book. It's about, it's heading towards 300 pages, but it's packed with information and is a very easy read. Now, the debate over slavery is particularly important to my home city of Bristol, because Bristol made much of its money through slave trading, and hence there have been regular attempts to remind Bristolians of this as part of the race issue. A couple of years ago, the local council, almost unanimously with the exception of the Conservatives, passed a resolution calling for the payment of reparations to black people. It was one of the first councils outside London to do so. Now, that's one aspect of the slave trade, and there is a gallery on Bristol's involvement in the slave trade at Bristol's Shed Museum, and that's actually worth going around. The Shed as a whole is well worth a visit, especially the ground floor, where you can see some of the items Bristol manufactured in its heyday, such as cars, buses, and aircraft. And one of the aircraft is the Flea, which was supposed to be a small family car, like a small family car. It was supposed to be the small family plane which the head of the family would fly to work. Now, there have been people demanding a separate museum of slavery in Bristol to compete with those at Liverpool and Nantes in France. I think they've been disappointed. They approached Asher Craig, the head of Equalities and vice mayor, I think, deputy mayor of the city council a few years ago, and she said find private investment for it. Nevertheless, when the BLM riots kicked off a few years ago, she appeared on Radio 4 saying that she was looking, she wanted a museum of slavery in Bristol. Now, the slavery gallery in Emshed, I gather, talks about slavery in Bristol, which certainly predates the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, we were enslaving and selling English slaves to Ireland and Viking Ireland in the early Middle Ages. I mean, Bishop Wulfstan of Worcester came down in about 1080 to preach against it, and he was so effective that it stopped. But even so, in the 12th century, when a group of French clergy were on a tour to collect money to pay for the renovation of one of the French cathedrals, they had one of them had the mistake of having dinner one evening on an Irish boat, and they were told, don't do it again, because if you do, they quietly slip anchor, and before you know it, you're in Ireland. Now, Bristolians were also enslaved by the Barbary pirates. They were Muslim pirates from what is now North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, I think Tunisia as well. And they raided the coast of southern Europe from Italy, France, Spain, right up to the southwest coast of Britain, Ireland, and even as far as Iceland. And they also raided North America. In 1625 they took ships from Boston, which might surprise some people who think that slavery was unique to America and is a defining feature of American society from following the 1619 Project, and the idea that before the modern USA was created by the founding fathers, it was built on the basis of slavery. In actual fact, it existed across the world, and Americans were just as likely to be as enslaved as anybody else. Now, there are some excellent books on Barbary pirates. Charles Sumner wrote White Slavery in the Barbary States, which has recently been republished. I think it's available on Amazon. He's a 19th century writer, and he gives the contemporary accounts of the enslavement of whites, sometimes their escape by the Barbary pirates, right? Through the personal experience of the young English merchant Abraham Brown, after a settler in Massachusetts, we may learn how these were conducted. This is his inclusion of a contemporary account from one of the victims of the Barbary pirates, who describes how he was sold in the marketplace. In 1655, before the liberating power of Cromwell had been acknowledged, he was captured together with the whole crew and carried into Sallee. His own words in his memoirs, still preserved, will best tell his story. On landing, he says, an exceeding great company of the most dismal speculators were led to behold us in our captivated condition. There was liberty for all sorts to come and look on us, that whosoever had a mind to buy any of us on the day appointed for a sale together the market might see, as I may say, what they would like to have for their money. whereby we had too many comfortless visitors, both from the town and the country, one saying he would buy this man and the other that. To comfort us, we were told by the Christian slaves already there, if we met with such and such patrons, our usage would not be so bad as we supposed, though indeed our men found the usage of the best bad enough. Fresh victuals and bread were supplies, I suppose, to feed us up for the market, that we might be in some good plight against the day we were to be sold. And now I come to speak of our being sold into this doleful slavery. It was doleful in respect to the time and manner. As to the time, it was on our Sabbath day, in the morning, about the time the people of God were about to enjoy the liberty of God's house. This was the time our bondage was confirmed. Again, it was sad in respect to the manner of our selling. Being all of us brought into the marketplace, we were led about, 2 or 3 at a time, in the midst of a great concourse of people, both from town and country, who had a full sight of us. And if that did not satisfy, they would come and feel of your hand, or look into your mouth to see whether you were sound in health, or to see by the hardness of your hand whether you have been a labourer or not. The manner of buying is this: he that bids the greatest price hath you, they bidding one upon another until the highest has you for a slave, whoever he is, or wherever he dwells. As concerning myself, being brought to the market in the weakest condition of any of our men, I was led forth among the cruel multitude to be sold. As yet being undiscovered what I was like to have been sold at a very low rate, not above £15 sterling, whereas our ordinary seamen were sold at £30 or £35 sterling, and 2 boys were sold for £40 apiece. And being in this sad posture led up and down at least 1 hour and a half, during which time a Dutchman, that was our carpenter, discovered me to some Jews. They increased from £50 to £75, which was the price my patron gave for me, being 300 ducats. And had I not been so weakened and in these rags, indeed I made myself more so than I was, for sometimes as they led me I pretended I could not go, and did often sit down. I say, had not these things been, in all likelihood I had been sold for as much again in the market, and thus I had been dearer and the difficulty greater to be redeemed. During the time of my being led up and down the market, I was possessed with the greatest fears, not knowing who my patron might be. I feared it might be one from the country who would carry me where I could not return, or it might be one in and about Sully, of which we had sad accounts, and in many other distracting thoughts I had. And though I was like to have been sold unto the most cruel man in Sully, there being but one piece of 8 between him and my patron, yet the Lord was pleased to cause him to buy me, of whom I may speak to the glory of God as the kindest man in the place. Yeah. And people from Bristol were also captured and enslaved by the Barbary pirates. Incidentally, the thumbnail for this video is of Moulay Sultan of Morocco, who was the king of Morocco at the time when the pirates were going out raiding Western Europe for white slaves. And but continuing with Sumner's book, there is also in the same early source a quaint description of what occurred to a ship from Bristol captured in 1621 by an Algerine corsair. The Englishmen were all taken out except 4 youths, over whom the Turks, as these barbarians were often called by early writers, put 13 of their own men to conduct the ship as a prize to Algiers, and one of the pirates, a strong, able, stern and resolute person, was appointed captain. These 4 poor youths, so the story proceeds, being thus fallen into the hands of merciless infidels, began to study and complot all the means they could for the obtaining of their freedom. They considered the lamentable and miserable estates that they were like to be in, as to be debarred forever from seeing their friends and country, to be chained, beaten, and made slaves, and to eat the bread of affliction in the galleys, all the remainder of their unfortunate lives, and which was the worst of all, never to be takers of the heavenly word and sacraments. Thus, being quite hopeless, and for anything they knew forever helpless, they sailed 5 days and nights under the command of the pirates, when on the 5th night God, in his great mercy, showed them a means for their wished-for escape. A sudden wind arose, when, the captain coming to help take in the mainsail, 2 of the English youths suddenly took him by the breech and threw him overboard. But by fortune he fell into the bunt of the sail, where quickly catching hold of a rope, he, being a very strong man, had almost gone into ship again, which John Cook, perceiving, leapt speedily to the pump and took of the pump brake or handle and cast it to William Long, bidding him knock him down, which he was not long in doing. But lifting up the wooden weapon, he gave him such a polt on the pate as made his brains forsake the possession of his head, with which his body fell into the sea. The Corsair slave dealers were overpowered. The 4 English youths drove them from place to place in the ship, and having coursed them from poop to the forecastle, they were valiantly killed 2 of them, and gave another a dangerous wound or 2, who, to escape the further fury of their swords, leapt suddenly overboard to go seek his captain. The other 9 Turks ran between decks, where they were securely fastened. The English now directed their course to St. Lucas in Spain, and, in short time, by God's aid, happily and safely arrived at the said port, where they sold the 9 Turks for galley slaves for a good sum of money, and, as I think, a great deal more than they were worth. He that shall attribute such things as these, says the ancient historian, grateful for the triumph of freedom, to the arm of flesh and blood, is forgetful, ungrateful, and in a manner atheistical. I don't think those sentiments would be very popular now, not at the end. And possibly some people were shocked that they'd sold their captives, but yeah, as their captives had enslaved them, I think it's a fitting punishment. Now, the Barbary pirates weren't the only people enslaving Europeans in this period from outside Europe. They also included, the Ottoman Turks also included slavery when they conquered the Balkans, right up as far into Hungary, and in the mid-17th century they were at the gates of Vienna. And yeah. Yeah. I mean, Thomas Sowell in Race and Culture, a Worldview, talks about the enslavement of European slaves by the Ottoman Turks, and I mean, the word slave actually comes from the word Slav, because so many slaves came from Eastern Europe, Slavs from Eastern Europe, both and they were enslaved both by Western Europeans and by Muslims. And he says here, in the 1820s, 6,000 Greeks were sent to Egypt as slaves, and a century later a report to the British Parliament noted that both white and black slaves were still being traded in Egypt and Turkey, years after blacks had been emancipated in the United States. In the 16th century, peace terms imposed by the Ottoman Turks required that the defeated Hungarians to send them 10% of their population each decade as slaves. It was common for the Ottomans to requisition a certain number of boys from unconquered European populations, these boys to be taken into the service of the imperial government. Now, I do wonder if the experience of conquest and subjugation under the Ottoman Empire and the atrocities the Ottomans committed when in the late 19th century, early decades of the last century, when their empire broke up, is responsible for it's responsible for the real hatred of Islam and Turks in the Balkans. And also I wonder if it's the reason why the Balkan nations and countries like Hungary do not want to receive Muslim asylum seekers from places like Syria, the Middle East and North Africa. I think possibly it's led to a very, very deep and hostile attitude towards Muslims in those regions. Now, the purpose of telling everyone this is not to incite any hatred towards towards Muslims or Turks or anyone else, but simply to point out that the enslavement of Western Europeans is also part of the story of slavery and slavery in the West. And I'm very concerned that the concentration on the transatlantic slave trade is giving people the impression that slavery was something done by white Europeans to black Africans. And I feel this should be corrected. I think we do need, any museum of slavery has to include the Barbary pirates, has to include the enslavement of whites by the forces of Islam in the Balkans, the Barbary pirates who continued raiding, right up into the 19th century. I think they were only finally stopped when the French invaded Algeria. And this needs to be told as well, to add balance to it. Anyway, thank you for listening.